Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Radical Candor Podcast. I'm Kim Scott, co-founder of Radical Candor and author of Radical Candor and Just Work.
I'm Jason Rosoff, CEO and co-founder of Radical Candor.
And I'm Amy Sandler, your host for the Radical Candor Podcast. And today we are talking sandwiches. Not the tasty sandwiches that were beloved by our friend Joey Tribbiani. Is it Tribbiani? Was it Tribbiani?
No idea.
Okay.
No idea. I can't help you.
It is Tribbiani.
It is Tribbiani. For those of us who watched Friends and we know who we are, we also know Joey loves sandwiches, but also who doesn't love a sandwich? Sandwiches look delicious on the outside and inside they're stuffed with something you can't quite identify. But somehow the sandwich maker is hoping those two pieces of artisanal bread are holding the mystery meat together and you will accept what's inside without too many questions. This is the feedback sandwich. If you're not familiar with the feedback sandwich, let me explain a little history, which I was not aware of. So thank you, Brandy, for bringing this to our attention. In the 1980s, the feedback sandwich was popularized by Mary Kay Cosmetics founder Mary Kay Ash. In her 1989 book, Mary Kay on People Management, Ash writes, quote, "Sandwich every bit of criticism between two heavy layers of praise. A manager should be able to tell someone when something is wrong without bruising an ego in the process. Never giving criticism without praise is a strict rule for me. No matter what you're criticizing, you must find something good to say, both before and after. This is called the sandwich technique." End quote. Well, this was touted as a way for managers who are nervous about giving feedback, and I'm raising my hand here, to soften the blow, or a way to give criticism to sensitive employees. And it was really popular in the 1980s and 1990s, along with, I think, Jason and Kim, from an earlier podcast, you talked about the let's go out for a cup of coffee for criticism. So it has
the cappuccino of doom.
Yeah. The sandwich method has fallen out of favor in the past 20 years, maybe because it's ineffective. People are starting to realize that being nice isn't always kind. And before we get into the downside of the sandwich, I thought we would start with why do you think this was so popular for such a long time? And people still refer to the feedback sandwich, otherwise known, dare I say, as the shit sandwich. Kim, why do you think this was so popular?
I think that it was popular because there is a kernel of wisdom there. It is not just idiotic advice. And I think the kernel of wisdom in this is that you want to make sure that you're focusing on the good stuff. You want to make sure that you're expressing gratitude to people for the things that they are doing right. And so that's a good thing to do. There are many, many problems with it. I'll talk about a couple of them and then we can keep parsing. Or do you not want to talk about the problems yet?
Oh, well, I'm all for I love a problem. But what struck me when I was reading this was, in some ways, we talk about the importance of starting by soliciting feedback to really start to build more trust, to model that we're willing to take it before we start dishing it out. Another food metaphor. We talk about giving praise before giving criticism, but this is from the perspective of having more frequent conversations. And from my mind, there's something about needing to both counteract that negativity bias that we all have of sort of over amplifying the criticism, but also there may be something here about this is my way that I show care personally is by using the double praise. Again, there's problems with it, but for me, I feel I wonder, Jason, do you feel like there's any relationship between the need to care personally and the intention of having these two pieces of praise? Maybe a good intention gone bad.
I think you're absolutely right. I think there's a relationship. People certainly connect in their mind. They connect praise with care personally, saying something not quote unquote nice with care personally.
Yeah.
I think the reason why this methodology was so popular is slightly more insidious and does have to do with human psychology, which is that it's a beautiful lie. The lie is that somehow you can layer criticism in between two pieces of praise and the criticism doesn't bruise the ego, right? The quotation was, we need to be able to deliver criticism without bruising somebody else's ego. The problem is that criticism always has the chance of bruising someone's ego, even if you just said something wonderful about them.
No matter how delicious that bread is.
Right. It doesn't take the sting away. And I think it's important that we acknowledge that criticizing someone's work is awkward. It's like it feels awful. No one wants to do it. No one looks forward to doing it. And so if someone comes along and says, hey, I've got the solution for you, and it's mechanical. You don't have to think about it. All you have to do is put one piece of praise on the top and one piece of praise on the bottom, and it's going to be fine. It fixes the problems created by criticizing somebody's work, but it doesn't. That's the lie. Mm-hmm. The lie is that it doesn't actually fix that.
Yeah, it's a false promise of emotional novocaine, which, as we have said before, does not exist. If I had emotional novocaine to offer, I would give it away for free, but I don't have it.
And people will often ask that question in workshops and keynotes, how can I say something without hurting someone's feelings?
But I want to go back to, and the answer is you can't. It's easy. Unfortunately. But you can say it in a way that shows that you care. It's like, imagine if a doctor said, how can I give you a shot that you really need to get? That's not going to hurt. The shot is just going to sting a little bit, but that doesn't mean that the doctor shouldn't give you the shot. But I want to go back to a couple of other things you said, if I may, Amy, unless I'm knocking us off track.
No, well, I don't even know where you're going. So the road's wide open.
So you pointed out to the order of operations. You want to solicit radical candor first, and I think I say that all the time, and I should probably be more precise, which is you should solicit criticism. When you're soliciting feedback, you are not fishing for compliments. Actually, you want to make sure that the other person, you've created a possibility for the other person to give you criticism. And I know that's a little bit off track of the feedback sandwich, but I think it's an important point.
It's not off track. I mean, it is off track from this podcast episode topic, but it is something I'm really curious to get your opinion on, because in doing workshops recently with groups that are either predominantly or all individual contributors, one of the things I've found was that it can be hard for individual contributors to start by soliciting criticism as a practice. And so I know, you wrote the book really targeted for managers as a way to lay their power down, to start by soliciting criticism. And I will encourage individual contributors to start by, what worked well, so that I can do more of it. Ultimately, also soliciting criticism. But I'm curious, do you feel as strongly that it's critical for individual contributors to start by soliciting criticism? I have found, for example, just in a recent workshop, there was an individual contributor who said, I am so hard on myself. I'm always getting a lot of criticism. And so without soliciting praise, I don't actually even know what's going well.
Yeah. No, nothing I say is an absolute, but as a general rule, if you're
is that an absolute?
Yes, that may be the only absolute thing. But and I'm not even sure that's an absolute. I'm sure there are some absolutes. Nothing is absolute. But some things are true and some things are not true. There is such a thing as truth. So anyway, I think that it is important as a general rule. It's important for you as an individual contributor. If you feel like you don't know what you're, in particular, if you want to make sure that you're building a good relationship with your boss, it's really important to make sure that your boss is giving you feedback. And there are some bosses who are likely to give you feedback, and others who are likely to give you all bread and no meat. Where's the beef? You can ask, or when you get feedback from your boss. And then I want to go back to another thing, but you were going to say something.
Oh, no, I just was aware Jason is usually our generational monitor, but for those folks who might not know what where's the beef reference is, Jason, do you want to?
YouTube is your friend. Yes, you can find evidence of this ad campaign on YouTube. I like the general guidance, and I would build on it to say, if you are getting a ton of one type of feedback, let's say you're getting a ton of praise, like positive reinforcement, and very little critical feedback, it definitely does not it does not connote that you are doing nothing wrong. Like that is
Yes.
that is the mistake. Is that and
That
and
is
the reverse is
sad
also
truth.
true. Correct. If you're getting tons of criticism and really no praise, that also doesn't mean you're not doing anything right. And that's why it's important to seek both kinds of feedback and to try to find some kind of balance. I've definitely had bosses who were better at one or the other, and I had to adapt my approach to soliciting feedback to make sure that I was getting a balanced perspective on my performance, because I'm also generally a very self-critical person, and I think it can be very sort of damaging to my long-term motivation to be in a cycle of like constantly being criticized by my boss and by myself. Like that is not like a helpful
Toxic stew
place for me to be. Yeah.
I can relate to that. And so as we go back from what we've just been talking about with soliciting feedback, looking for a balance, one of the things that I'm curious about, Kim, also with your guidance, was that feedback conversations, you want them to be 1, 2, 5-minute, impromptu. You want them to be frequent. You've often said like brushing and flossing, not a root canal. And I wonder, especially when it comes to avoiding the shit sandwich, which we'll get into some of the problems, but is part of the problem because there's sort of this feedback debt that it's like, here's my one chance to tell you everything, and I'm just going to do it all in the sandwich, basically like a buffet, and then I'm never going to have a la carte conversation. We really want more of these a la carte conversations rather than one big thing. I'm curious if you think that might tie into it as well, about frequency.
I think that even in a really short conversation, it's possible to say a couple of good things and a couple of bad things, or a couple of bad things and one good thing. It's possible to do that even very quickly. I think it really depends on the person and the context about what is going to work and what is not going to work. Obviously, if you're talking to me and you're going to give me some criticism, you better only give me the criticism, because I will hear only the praise if you
Is
give me
that true?
But yes, it is actually. I think a lot of people say, "Oh, I'm so hard on myself. I guess maybe I'm really easy on myself."
Do you have a positivity bias? I don't think I've ever.
I have a strong. Well, look, I was raised as a Christian Scientist. I was raised to believe that nothing is bad in the world, and that I was God's perfect child. So that's a pretty strong.
That's a solid basis. For a good
positivity.
For a strong self-esteem. Yeah.
There were some very great things about the religion. There's some problems.
Yeah.
I didn't go to the doctor, but there were some good things about it too.
And do you feel like that has really stayed with you throughout your life? This sense, I have observed that, just that you have this seemingly sort of superhuman capacity to really be open to criticism. And so do you think it really just comes from that deep-seated belief that you were just talking about?
I think that definitely helps, because no matter how bad you tell me I've done, I still have this safety net of positivity underneath me. And so maybe I don't know, who knows but like I will find myself, sometimes I'll be writing something, and I have a lot of people talk about negative talk. I have a lot of, this is so good, you're a genius. I have a lot of positive self-talk going on.
What would it be like to spend a day inside your head? I'm going to have to just take a page from your book.
Yeah. So anyway, yes, but it depends on I don't think you have to have been raised. I think some people are prone to think well of themselves. And with those people, you may need to focus on criticism alone. Other people are prone to think badly of themselves. And for those people, if you want your criticism to land, you better not mingle it with any praise. And then there are some people who do benefit from hearing both at the same time. But if you're going to get both at the same time, you need to really mean both.
Mm.
So maybe it's helpful to really parse what we think are the specific issues with the feedback sandwich. So one of them, Kim, you just mentioned, is you have to really, if you're going to use both praise and criticism, you really have to mean it. It has to be sincere. The other thing is that, is there a balance of, am I only getting criticism, I need more praise, or vice versa? Jason, I've heard you also mention one of the issues.
Well, sorry to interrupt. Now we're talking about giving it, not getting it. So you should be aware, I think, in your head, like, when was the last time I told this person I gave voice to what I appreciate about this person? And that should always be, I think, top of mind, no matter what conversation you're having. Like, remember that this person is, you're talking to this person because it's worth talking to the person, not because you think they're worthless.
Jason, what do you think are the primary issues with the feedback sandwich? I've heard you say one of them is that it's just not clear, right? Because it's like, this was great, this was terrible, this was great. So it's just too much information. The person doesn't know what to do with it.
Yeah, so here's the biggest challenge that I find with any feedback conversation is that there's almost always too much information in a feedback conversation to like actually process in a single discussion. Mm-hmm. And so the idea of like adding more things to that conversation makes me think like you're probably going to wind up with some of it being muddy at the end of it. And the risk, I think, that we take with the feedback sandwich type of approach is that we might have a different perception in our head of which of those pieces actually landed than the other person on the receiving end of it. So like, you're talking to Kim, they heard the positive and not the negative. If you're talking to me, maybe I heard the negative and not the positive. But in your mind, maybe you're like, I was clear about it. We had a great discussion about all of these things, but it may not be clear what actually stuck in the other person's brain. And so that's where the lack of clarity comes from, is that it's hard to parse all of this information. It's hard to parse a single conversation. I realize I'm using my P's a lot. I wonder if I'm popping them all over the place.
Not at all. You sound great.
It's hard to parse.
You have perfect P's.
That makes me feel so much better. When people have said this to me, like earnestly, like I think this is the right way to do it, I always say, okay, but it makes it even more important that you're very clear about what next steps are, because without talking about how this person is going to apply what they've learned in this conversation, you may never know that they missed a big chunk of what you said. But there's that quote that I don't know the quotation that I don't know we know who to attribute it to, but the biggest mistake in communication is believing that it has happened.
Yes.
That only gets, the more you layer into the conversation, the worse that problem gets. So anyway, that's why I think it has a high probability of being unclear.
Yeah. And then I think the other reason why it's often unclear goes back to something Amy said a moment ago, which is very often people try to think of praise as the way that they show they care. And praise that only goes up on the care personally dimension is likely to wind up in ruinous empathy. That is the purpose of praise, is to help people know what to do more of. And so that includes a challenge for them to do more of that thing. It's not just a way to show you care. And if you try to divide praise and criticism, and you say criticism is how you challenge directly, then you're going to wind up with obnoxiously aggressive criticism because you haven't shown you cared when you gave the criticism. And you're going to wind up with ruinously empathetic praise. And that just leaves people sort of bewildered. So I think you want to make sure that you're not using praise as sort of the thing you have to do in order to get to what you really want to do, which is criticize them. And that's I think, one of the fundamental problems with the shit sandwich.
I'm just thinking of my dog. I think you're just having a pill pocket, a yummy pill pocket, but inside is the medicine. And then they didn't even notice the medicine because the pill pocket was so delicious.
The pill pocket works. They still take the medicine and it helps, unlike the shit sandwich, which doesn't work.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that came up as we were just describing our various food metaphors, I feel like the inherent challenge, Kim, what you were saying about praise and the relationship of praise and care personally, and criticism and challenge directly, I think it might go back to what you were suggesting earlier, Amy, which is like there's a sense of time is of the essence, and like I have a bunch of stuff that I want to say. And so the manager, like so speaking for the position of being a manager, as a manager, like I have 37 more meetings that I have to get done today. I'm not going to see this person for another week at the very least. I have a lot of stuff that I need to accomplish in the next 10 minutes. And in your mind, you're being efficient. You're like, we're going to get all this stuff done in a single conversation. And it's very tempting, especially if you're like, and then this person's going to have a balanced view of what I think is going well and what's not going so well. And I think that the desire for efficiency is the source of a lot of regret in feedback conversations, because it leads to frustration very quickly. Because you start the conversation, you're like, here's something great that you did. And the person is just starting to process that. And you're like, great, hold on a second. Here's something that you did wrong. And in your mind, you're like, this is helpful because we're going quickly and we're going to cover all this stuff. And for the other person, Amy, you and I talk about this a lot. Like, integration time is incredibly important. So you need to pause after each of these things and have a conversation and ask questions. And actually, like, you need the challenge directly part of the praise for it to stick. Because without that conversation of like, how are you going to use this and how are you actually going to apply this in order to get better, often it sort of goes in one ear and out the other. And so without that pause, without that sort of demarcation of like, let's talk about what went well and how you're going to use that going forward. I think if you just dive into, here's something that could have been better in that conversation, you're likely to lose the value of the praise. And similarly, without time to integrate on the criticism, without time to ask questions or understand better what the person's perspective is or how you're suggesting they might use it, approach the work differently based on the feedback that you're giving, you lose the ability for that person to put it to good use. But the feedback sandwich doesn't suggest any of that, right? It actually suggests that it's sort of like all one thing and eaten at the same time. That's why the food metaphor is bringing this up for me, is it's like, you don't bite through the bread and stop and just chew the bread of the sandwich, and then move on to the meat of the sandwich. And
it's like, how do you chew an Oreo? I mean, this is... Yeah.
I mean, some people probably do eat their sandwiches out there. So if I have just maligned the way that you, it seems like I'm making fun of the way you eat your sandwich. That is not my intention. But like, very few people, I think, eat in that way. And that is actually, I think, as you were giving the pill metaphor, the pill pocket metaphor, that's what was occurring to me. It's like, we don't consider the pieces individually, and that really makes it hard to make any use of them.
Yeah. Yeah. And also, if you think, to go back to the other problem with the pill pocket, is that the whole purpose of the pill pocket and kind of the purpose of the feedback sandwich is now I'm going to say the thing, but the person won't notice I've said it. So I won't have to notice that they're upset until, and then they can go be upset by themselves, as opposed to, if they are upset, I want to remain present for those emotions so that I can show that I care, so that we can help figure out how to make things better moving forward.
That feels like a really important point, which is, going back to you saying, if we had emotional novocaine, we would share it. There is something, I think, what I really most appreciate about radical candor is that willingness to be with other people as they're going through a hard time, and how that really is at the core of how you deepen relationships. And it really wasn't until I started working at Radical Candor where I really felt that, like, rather than shying away from those difficult conversations, the act of being with each other as we manage difficult emotions is how we build trust, and that shared sense of that person really does have my back and it's okay and it's safe. And so even though it might be uncomfortable, like, there is a real value that we don't have the proverbial pill pocket, that we really are with each other for each of those events. Jason,
Go ahead, Jason. Sorry.
I was going to say, you're making an argument that it's actually essential to avoid the, like, anesthetizing one another might seem useful, but it is actually directly counter to building durable, real relationships. Like, avoiding the emotion or trying to mask the emotion actually impedes our ability to develop real relationships, which ultimately impedes our ability to give and receive feedback from each other and collaborate effectively.
Yeah, you're right. I went to the dentist recently and I got some real novocaine, and I bit the hell out of the inside of my cheek. you know? So actually, if I did have emotional novocaine, I would not give it out for free because it would be very dangerous. We would cause damage, more damage than if you can notice someone's emotions immediately and adjust immediately. Yeah. I think that it's so, people often, when I'm coaching someone, they'll be planning a hard conversation and they will decide they're not going to offer the feedback sandwich, and they plan out how they're going to say the thing. And then they'll call me after the conversation and they'll say, I screwed up. The person was upset. And maybe that does mean they screwed up, but maybe it doesn't. Like maybe it just means that the person was upset, and good for them for noticing that and for sitting there with those emotions. I mean, I don't know if folks have seen that kids movie Inside Out, and I don't know if this is true in terms of psychology, but in the movie, it says that the purpose of sorrow is to let the people around you know when you need their help. You know, like the child starts to cry, and that's when her parents finally realize that she's upset and needs their attention. And not that management is like parenting. I want to be very clear on that. That's the wrong mindset. But I do think that when we communicate on an emotional plane and on an intellectual plane at the same time. And if your goal going into the conversation is to avoid all emotion, you're not going to communicate very well. You don't want to cause the person intentionally. I was working with one person in my career who will go unnamed. And after listening to Radical Candor, he thought his job as a boss was to intentionally upset people. And I just want to be very clear. It's not. You're not supposed to intentionally upset people. But if your whole goal is to avoid the other person's emotions, then you're not going to communicate very well.
Yeah, and sort of thinking about emotions from the other perspective, in season 1 of the Radical Candor podcast, Dick Costello, former CEO of Twitter, said, managing by trying to be liked is the path to ruin. So, and we were talking about
path to ruinous empathy.
Yeah. And, we were talking about for the person giving the feedback, why we might use the sandwich. And because we as managers some of us might have a really strong need to be liked. And so how have you, and Jason, I'll start with you, like what have you done if this was a challenge for you or people that you've coached to overcome this need to be liked, to give clear, actionable feedback rather than the sandwich?
So this is definitely a problem for me personally. I do have the desire, I have the desire to be liked. And I would say it's a slight variation on that theme. I have desire for harmony. Like in my environment and in my relationships, I have a desire for harmony. And so disharmony is like very difficult for me. And I would love to say that I could give you great advice. The only thing I do is I know now that when I'm feeling discomfort due to some amount of disharmony, that I can remind myself intellectually at the cognitive level that is not a bad thing. That like disharmony is an essential part of building good relationships. Because if we can't talk about what's going wrong, we can't make it right.
Yeah, then you get false harmony.
Correct. Yeah, you get conformity by force, essentially, when you make it impossible for people to talk about what's going wrong.
Well, and I think that was what we were just talking about, Jason, too, which is that you're sacrificing long-term harmony. Like for me, even if we have had short-term moments, maybe in a call that were uncomfortable and felt potentially disharmonious, it actually, the outcome is a longer term harmony. Like we are willing to invest in the long-term relationship and go through that short-term discomfort.
Yes. And I think it does require, I think that has to happen at the level of cognition. If you seek to be liked or you seek harmony, this is like a Kahneman thing, like you have to engage the slow part of your brain in order to interrupt that, because the fast thinking part of your brain is going to automatically seek harmony. It's going to automatically seek to be liked. Your instinctual reaction will be to do exactly the wrong thing. And so it takes quite a lot of discipline, both emotional and intellectual discipline, to actually click on the cognitive part, to click on cognition and spend the energy to actually to recognize that the short-term disharmony is not in fact a threat to my existence, even though that's kind of what it feels like if you are seriously want to be liked or to seek harmony.
Yeah, and as you were talking, Jason, I realized that the desire for to be liked or the desire for harmony it's not actually the path to ruinous empathy. It's the path to manipulative insincerity. Like when I want to be liked, I'm afraid of that if I tell someone something, when I'm afraid that if I tell them the thing, they won't like me, then I'm being manipulatively insincere. If I'm afraid, if I tell the person I'm going to hurt their feelings, then I'm being ruinously empathetic. And I think it's important. It's very hard to admit to oneself that one is being manipulatively insincere because it sounds so horrible. But I think very often the feedback sandwich is a desire to be liked or to create false harmony. And in that respect, the feedback sandwich is sort of manipulatively insincere. And often the kind of praise that you get in a feedback sandwich, the praise itself is both manipulative and insincere. Oh, you're so awesome. That presentation was a piece of shit, but great shoes. Like that does not make anybody feel better.
Yeah.
Those kind of sort of off the cuff stuff you would say to a dog, praise, and then followed by really, in the middle of that is this really harsh, the sort of kiss me, kick me, kiss me. Sandwich is awful.
I think your example is like exaggerated for impact, but I've seen and shamefully been on the delivering side of much subtler but equally insincere. Like, oh, you came to the presentation so organized and like you had all the Post-its and everything were out like where everybody needed them, but like it was very unconvincing, and we're definitely not going to do the thing that you're trying to convince everybody of. But I think
but you chose some really great fonts.
Yeah, exactly. It's work related. You know what I'm saying? It's like it's actually contextually and on its own, like that organization thing might actually be really useful because if I said because you were so organized, it actually made it really easy when we transitioned from the presentation to the brainstorm. Like there's probably useful praise in there, but I threw it away.
Yeah. Yes.
Because I was rushing over it in order to get to the criticism.
I think that example of what Kim was sharing about like, you're so amazing and, the kiss me, kick me. For me, one of the stories that I share is telling this person, I love working with you. You're so amazing. We get along so great. I heard you were like throwing things in a meeting or, just like terrible something that I was like so afraid of saying. And then it's like, but it's so stressful. It wasn't just that it wasn't like praise at the end. It was actually completely negating everything that I had just said. But don't worry, it's okay. You're so amazing. It's so hard. So I don't know if that's like a sandwich with then like slathered in, mustard or like jam or something, but it's just like butter. But it's not praise so much as completely like taking them off the hook for the thing because you're trying to avoid the confrontation.
Yeah. I was, as you all were talking, I was trying to think of a real example for my career. And per what I said before about me only being able to remember the praise, I have this vivid memory of my boss telling me, you're going to have a great career at such and such a company, but I cannot remember what happened. Most of us, I remember is you're going to have a great career.
Most of us only remember like after the but. You're before the but.
So maybe you all can remember the criticism and not the praise, but I think it shows what like exactly. And I'm racking my brains because I remember that there was something really important after that but that I was doing wrong, that like something terrible had just happened. Actually, I had just made a big mistake, but all that's gone. All I remember is you're going to have a great career.
Maybe they said, but you said a lot and you didn't hear it till 20 years later. But it all worked out because then you got a story.
That I remember. I remember because she told, I am very sensitive to being told that I am stupid because I fail, or that I sound stupid because I failed kindergarten, actually. Like I'm very sensitive about that. And that hit, and she knew that actually, and that's why it hit home. But I also knew that she didn't, so that worked.
Yeah. The two-person horse costume of life, Kim is definitely the head. You know what I'm saying? Like, she's definitely
Jason and I
not
are jockeying
she's
for
not the rear. She's not
the
she's not
butt
behind
comma.
the butt.
Yes.
Let's
I will say in most workshops when I say, we try not to be too didactic, but the don't take it personally, it is followed closely by like, no offense, comma, but like that usually takes a
yeah, and of course I'm already offended as soon as someone
right. We
says
get
no
into the
offense.
comma, but
whatever you say next, I'm going to hate it.
Jason, what were you saying?
So we've set up a challenge here, which Kim, at the top of the episode, you basically said you need to focus on the good stuff. And we've also said you also need to focus on the bad. Like when something's going wrong, you need to focus on that. So now we've given people a tough challenge. We've said you can't do this. It's very difficult. It requires quite a lot of skill and intention to try to do that in a single conversation. But how do you get out? Like, how do you manage both of those
I will
things?
say one example that I've seen people talk about is sort of the open-faced sandwich. Like, hey, Jason, after this meeting, one thing that worked really well, sometimes it can be like the rose and the thorn or the plus and the minus. Like, one thing that worked really well was when you brought up the story about the two-headed horse, because we all understood what that looked like. And the other example that, we could have gotten a little more refined was, I can't think of it. It's too hard for me. But I think that example, something that worked well, something that was a challenge, that I would call an open-faced sandwich. Do you feel like that meets the bill?
Yeah. So I found that if you're going to do that, it's often helpful if there's like some reciprocity in that. Like a really great place to do that is to create a sort of ritual of it is at the end of a project. Like, what worked well, what could have been better. There are moments where I think that sort of the open-faced sandwich, the combination of those two things can be really helpful. I think if I needed to deliver tough feedback and I realized I hadn't focused on the good stuff up until that point, I think I have two options. One is to decide, can I delay by a short amount of time the criticism to make sure I take an opportunity to focus on the good stuff? Can I spend 10 minutes today and 10 minutes later this week, and we'll do one conversation about what's working well and one conversation about what could be better? Or if it was urgent, I might even, a better option as opposed to wasting that praise by like trying to throw it into that conversation would be to acknowledge, I realize that I'm at a deficit. I have not been focusing on the good stuff, but I wanted it. But if you're going to make good use of this critical feedback, I need to tell you right now. So let's talk about this now. We're going to put a minus in my focus on the good stuff column. And I commit to coming back to you and talking to you about that. Something along those lines. I don't know if I'd say it exactly that way, but I would, unless it was a part of a process, I think I'd still be careful. And even the open-faced sandwich approach, because I wouldn't want to waste either one of those pieces of feedback.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is really interesting. Like, don't be afraid to show your work. I want to acknowledge that I love working with you and that I have not told you that recently. And I'm sorry, and I'm going to do better on that. So you're sort of starting with some self-criticism. But what I have to tell you right now is critical. Are you open to it? Like, I think showing your work in that way is perfectly reasonable.
Can we change your butt to an and?
Yeah.
We can.
Okay. Yes, and. Yeah. Please do. And, by the way, I wonder if the story that I've told so often about taking my dog Belvedere for a walk, and this is sort of the origin story of Radical Candor, and the man on the street said, I can tell you really love that dog. That wasn't exactly praise, but it wasn't exactly not praise either. It was like sort of establishing.
It was moving up on care personally.
It was the perfect.
Yeah, I see you.
Yeah. But also like I can tell you, like, that's a positive thing to say to someone. I mean, I don't know if it's praise, but you could say it was. But, and he did say but, although he could have said and you're going to kill that dog if you don't teach her to sit, sit. And so in some senses, like, that's why with the feedback sandwich, like there are some problems with it, but it's not 100% a terrible idea. Like it, in general, in the course, like when I first got married, I kept a gratitude journal, and I would write down like 3 things every night before I went to sleep that I was grateful to Andy, my husband, for doing that day. And often there were like way more than 3. I was like, can we go to sleep now? And I would make sure that I said, the meaningful ones to him. And I think it is really important to make sure that you are focusing on the good stuff, but that you're doing that in a way that doesn't belittle the good stuff. And that you're also, I will also say of Andy, I wouldn't be married to him if I hadn't been able to offer him some criticism early on in our relationship. I think I told the story already, but I was doing yoga, and he sat down on the couch and started reading the paper, which I found sort of horrible. And I was like, my first instinct was, I'm not going to say anything, and I'm never going to see him again. Like, I can't stand this.
Wait, what was the issue that you're doing yoga at the same time he's just reading the paper? Was that the problem?
Well, he came into the room where I like to do yoga alone, and I had been single. I was 39 at the time. I'd been single alone. I did not want this man in the room with me reading the paper while I was doing yoga. I don't know, something about it rubbed me the wrong way. And I felt a little bit kind of like you did. I'm like, I'm being, Well,
I was just trying to understand what the root of the issue. Well, I didn't even know. Like, now I need some more context. Like, was this like you open the door, you start stretching, he pulls out the paper? Like, what's this?
I think the paper was on the couch. And
he was trying to be with you.
And he's like, I don't know what he was.
I could see,
like
it would be like,
I could see in his mind how he's like,
I'm with her, but I'm respecting her boundaries, but I'm still with her.
Yeah,
that was not how
I felt about it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Here's where I'm going. If you're on a date, somebody comes over. Like,
I wasn't on a date. He spent the night, and it was the next morning.
Well, that makes more sense. I mean, like,
aren't you still technically on the date?
like he's still.
It wasn't the first time he spent the night. Like we were moving towards moving.
You were just together. Like, should I even go on another date with this relationship to move quickly?
Here's the thing. The part that I totally agreed with is like, I think one of the hardest parts in relationships for a lot of people is to remember to lead separate lives. Like there's like this weird mashing of lives that happens in relationships. And so what I think Andy is the real hero of that story in my mind, because you said, Andy, get out of here. And he was like, okay, sure, no problem.
He didn't. Yeah, it's true.
I can deal with that. And I think you were totally right.
Just like have your boundary.
It's a good thing that you asked, and it's a great thing that he responded the way that he did, because to me, that's like really great relationship material right there.
Yes,
I agree with that, because I would not have, I would want that it would be, the thing is, I wouldn't do the yoga with the person there, because I'm like, oh, well, they're there, I shouldn't do the, and then I would feel resentful.
I mean, it was like he spent the night. I did yoga before I went to work, and I wasn't going to change my routine because he spent the night, because then I wouldn't want him to spend the night again, because I didn't want to change that particular routine for him.
I think that's such a great relationship story. Like such a positive relationship story. Yeah. It wasn't a totally ridiculous thing for Andy to do, which is why I was tempted to, I didn't want to nitpick, but I suddenly realized that it bugged me so much, rational or irrational, that I was never going to have a next date with him if I didn't ask him to leave the room. And I said it, and he was a little embarrassed, but he got up and he went in the other room, and then we had another date, and then we got married, So, so it's as easy as that, folks.
And this is just as easy. This has been How to Date with Kim Scott.
But the point is, you want to focus on the good stuff to have a good relationship. And when somebody does something that bugs the living shit out of you, don't give them a shit sandwich. Just tell them to stop doing it. Even if you're a little like, it's not that big a deal. Like I was trying to convince myself it doesn't matter. It's not that big of a deal, but it did matter. And it was that big of a deal to me.
Before you told that story, Kim, you said something that I think solves for the why. When you say the feedback sandwich is not a terrible idea, I think what you mean is if you replace praise with find a way to move up on care personally. So instead of making the sandwich like, here's a piece of feedback which is positive and is a thing you should continue to do. If you replace that with take time at the beginning of the conversation, intentionally find a way to move up on care personally, and then deliver your critical feedback. And at the end of the conversation, return to care personally to make sure the person understands like where this is coming from, that you do in fact believe in them and you want them to be successful. That's actually a good habit to make sure you're like wrapping the conversation in care personally, that you don't ignore it. Because it can be very easy for a criticism conversation to become a sort of technical discussion. That's one of the things that I found with critical conversations where you're like starting to debate the finer points of exactly what happened and where it happened. And then it sort of feels like you're in court or something and you're defending or sort of like prosecuting your case and it's really easy, especially because we're engaging cognition so strongly, to put all of your energy into that and forget to come back to the like why we're having this conversation. Because this relationship is of value to me, because this person sitting in front of me is of value to me. Like that's why we're having this conversation. And so if we take away if the bread is care personally, and the meat is challenged directly, like that seems like a good balance to me.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you don't always have to say all the things. Like I think when I told Andy to leave the room, I kind of realized what was happening in my own head. I was still crazy, but I had worked on myself enough to recognize my own my own thought processes. And I realized, I like this person a lot and I do want to see him again. And for that reason, I have to ask him to leave the room. And I didn't say that to him. I just said, I didn't, there was no sandwich. I said, do you mind? I like to do yoga alone. Do you mind reading in the other room? It wasn't like this harsh criticism, but it was a request, which he was happy to.
And it also, the care is connecting to your intention. And I'm sure how it was said, it comes out through that.
Yeah.
You brought some stuff up and just this idea of framing more on the care personally, the challenge directly. One of the things I want us to pick up in a future podcast is about the differences between praise, especially in the radical candor framework of praise and criticism, do more of this, do less of that, versus gratitude, appreciation, recognition, and the ways in which those differ. So just highlighting back to your gratitude journal, how valuable that is, how words of appreciation, acts of recognition, et cetera, can go a long way, and how those are or are not as similar to praise. So would you all be open to a conversation about that?
I love that idea.
Delighted to have
all right.
it. Not just open to
Great
it.
idea,
oh my gosh,
Amy.
Thank you. I feel so seen and supported. Am I a genius?
You are a genius.
This is when I call this a need I have for someone to swing from the chandeliers. So this would be the moment when we cue the chandelier swinging.
Yes.
All right. Well, I think it's time now for our Radical Candor checklist. Tips you can use to start putting radical candor into practice now.
Tip number 1, instead of serving up a shit sandwich, wrap your feedback in corn. Context, observation, result, next steps. For example, some corn criticism I received from my boss. After the meeting, when I told you that you said a lot and recommended a speech coach, that's the context, you made a brush-off gesture with your hand, that's the observation. This makes me feel like you weren't hearing me and won't go to the speech coach I'm recommending, which would be a shame because if you stop saying so much, you'll be more effective. Result, go to the damn speech coach. Next steps. But that also works for praise. In the meeting context, when you offered both sides of the argument, That's the observation. You won credibility. That's the result. Do more of that. That's the next step.
Corn works in both directions. All right, tip number 2.
Yes.
Masking emotion impedes our ability to build real relationships and to collaborate effectively with each other. So make sure your feedback is kind and clear, and be present for whatever emotions might come up rather than trying to gloss over them.
Yes, and your criticism is kind and clear. Your praise is specific and sincere.
Tip number 3. The problem with the feedback sandwich is that it's hard for the person getting the sandwich to parse all the information, and you don't know how each part of the sandwich lands for that person, right? People don't eat one slice of bread first and then the filling of the sandwich and then contemplate each of those individually. The more you layer into the sandwich conversation, the more likely the action the person should take is unclear. So avoid that, separate the conversations, or take time to process each piece of feedback.
Tip number 4. Another problem with the feedback sandwich is that it's not messy, and these conversations often feel messy, and that's okay.
I had a deliciously messy sandwich yesterday for lunch.
Messy is good.
There's something I appreciated about it. And I feel like it's tempting not to appreciate the messy conversation. It's tempting to see that as a form of failure, like you were describing earlier, but it's not.
Well, for more tips,
exactly,
if not sandwiches, go ahead, visit radicalcandor.com/resources, where you can download our free learning guide, sign up for Radical Candor on Masterclass, get our lit video book, register for our workplace comedy series, The Feedback Loop, and more. Show notes for this episode, head to radicalcandor.com/podcast. Praise in public and private, criticize in private. If you like what you hear, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. If you have criticism for us or just recipes for your favorite sandwich, go ahead, email us, podcast@radicalcandor.com. Oh, breaking news. There is, in fact, a beer called Radical Candor, and I guess that can help wash down all those difficult conversations. We'll put that in the show.
A Vermont beer. I think they even called the beer Radical Candor. I mean, it's been around for years, and I no longer drink, but luckily when it first came out, I was still drinking, and I drank some Radical Candor beer, and I loved it.
As they say, you don't just dish it out, you drink it.
The closest thing you'll get to emotional novocaine is the Radical Candor beer.
This podcast was not brought to you by the Radical Candor beer.
But we love it anyway.
That's right. Bye for now.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks for joining us. Our podcast features Radical Candor co-founders Kim Scott and Jason Rosoff, is produced by our Director of Content, Brandy Neal, and hosted by me, Amy Sandler. Music is by Cliff Goldmacher. Go ahead and follow us on Twitter @Candor and find us online at radicalcandor.com.